Have your eyes ever become so accustomed to the mess that you don't even see it anymore? Jesus saw something at that temple in Jerusalem, and I'm thinking that his eyes, the eyes of Jesus, see things the way God sees things. I'm thinking that my eyes, your eyes, are not the same. Sometimes we're out of focus. Sometimes we have the wrong focus. We're distracted. Or we're so accustomed to the clutter that there are things that we really no longer see. So we have an opportunity during these weeks of Lent to really try to imagine that Jesus has a real good opportunity to help us to see what he sees in our hearts, in our lives, in our world. Last week, we used the word glory. And it was a counterintuitive word. And Jesus was describing in that passage to his disciples as they had begun to come to the place where they confessed that you are the Messiah. And there was that resonating and praise moment around that. And then Jesus began to prepare his followers for the journey that he's on, and they as well. A journey that will include suffering, the cross, and death. And I think of a scene in Dances with Wolves, in one of those scenes, I won't go into details, where one of those Native Americans says, "You're hurting my ears." It's kind of how I imagine the disciples when Jesus starts to talk like that. But resurrection and the ripping, the tearing of the screen in the temple that separated the glory of God, the Holy of Holies, the innermost sacred part of the temple, where God was believed to be fully present. That separation was torn asunder as you and I, dear believers, gained a special access to God's abundant grace, never felt or known before. Ooh, do we take that for granted? Through the sacrifice, the death of Jesus, and God lifting him up, lifting us up to new life. The counterintuitive word, therefore, that I reflect on and that kind of strikes me as I take in this scene of Jesus is upset, Jesus is anger, Jesus mad. As we journey towards Good Friday, the Last Supper, and all the events of Holy Week, that word I think of is love. Jesus at the temple. And this drama that unfolds. And I think of, yes, a counterintuitive word, I suppose, love. The things that Jesus does because of love. The things that we learn to do because of the love that we find in Jesus. Today, we ask, how in the course of biblical history, of being a part of God's chosen people, those who walk in a life in covenant with Yahweh, who is promise keeper, lawgiver, creator, and sustainer of life, How is it that we align our lives and our faith and the things that we actually embody and live out? How does that align with the founding truths that Jesus comes to represent and restate? An old newspaper journal in the American history was called the New York Packet. And in the October 30th edition, in the year 1787, this two-page, or actually 2 sheets and 4 pages, published the following. And it kind of helps to transport us back into time and get a little bit of reckoning, in some ways, kind of like John's 2nd chapter does. It helps us to transport ourselves back to the time of Jesus and those people of faith. But herein is included the richness and the fullness, the complexity and the beauty, as well as some of the tragedy of life. On the front page of that newspaper was an advertisement for the new almanac for the year 1788, with all the things that farmers will want to know. But you can buy that new almanac with or without a copy of the new Constitution of the U.S., which is now hot off the presses. It's just been finalized in Philadelphia a few weeks before. Americans are kind of eager to read it and then to weigh in on the debate surrounding its ratification. Also in that edition of the New York Packet was the first of the Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 1. It was anonymous, but we know that it was written by Alexander Hamilton. And in that paper, he asks this question: it falls to the people of the United States whether the people can live according to reason and choice, or whether they are fated, like all the people across history have been, to live according to accident and force. And that's a question that this Constitution of America should ratify, or that we should ratify, to answer that question. And on the next page of that same issue is an advertisement for a Negro wench who is carrying a 6-month-old child that she's still nursing. And by the way, you can stop off at the publisher's office and the same printer's office where you can pick up your new copy of the Constitution and put in your bid to buy a human as property. The beauty and the tragedy of American history. Right there. A snapshot located in those 4 pages of a single issue, an almanac, the Constitution, the Federalist Paper number 1, and an advertisement for Negro wench. Contradictions. Here in chapter 2, the Gospel of John, the people of God called Israel. Contradictions that, by the way, do not escape the eyes of God. One thing I've noticed, like forever, is that people continually remark about the suddenness of some latest social movement or form of political protest. Like, for instance, in this era, this time, and this place, Black Lives Matter came out of nowhere. Black Lives Matter doesn't come out of nowhere. Or the Me Too movement, or an angry gathering of citizens marching on January 6th to the Capitol. Such movements don't come out of nowhere with such a limited sense of the past. We live in a kind of a prison of the present. My citing of that New York Packet selection of Constitution, Hamilton's paper, and advertisement for Negro Wench, kind of in a way, is to jostle you, dear sister and brother, into the reality of the lived past, its similarities and its differences, its distance in time from us, and also its nearness. History with its contradictions, the clear-sightedness of people, and their blindness. That's in play all the time. It's tricky too, because much of the work in discussing what's happening around us, or perhaps at a macro level, is done in an all too often polemical fashion, didactic, one way or the other, the greatness of our people, or a litany of their atrocities, of our atrocities. And neither of those ways of discussing or pronouncing is a true accounting. And neither of them are very useful. Each advance a political agenda, but they do nothing in terms of fostering civic, faithful, and faith-filled conversations about our past as a people in a land with a history, or a people with a faith and a history, past, present, and especially our future. What we need is a usable past. When Jesus came to the temple with the eyes and the heart of God, there was a past. There was a narrative that began centuries before. Learning to see the people of God wrestling with what it means to be faithful, you need to know a little bit of the narrative, and I'll just mention a couple of things. You need to know that the people's yearning for a temple structure, in the first place, was a concession by God, who was on a journey with them. People cried out, "We want a place, a building." So in Samuel's time, God granted them this, but not during David's lifetime. You need to also know that abuses in temple leadership led to such utterances as Psalm 69, verse 9, "It is zeal for your house that has consumed me, even enduring insults from those who themselves are an insult." You need to know that the prophets whose legacies are preserved in the Bible built an imposing, grand, and rich, and forever challenging tradition of protest uttered toward civic leaders, political leaders, religious leaders. You should know that not only they wrote words, they spoke words, but they engaged in what we might call theater. Public acts staged attention-grabbing, boundary-pushing protest. They did things that got them jailed and whipped and killed, as had the Greeks, not so far away geographically and not so much earlier, had done similarly in their Greek tragedies and comedies, Greek drama playing a big role in the growing of democracy. Jesus goes to the temple, disrupts the money changers, the sellers of animals for sacrifice. It's part of this narrative. One of the things that I've said before, relates to the forces of centripetal and centrifugal force, maybe in engineering or physics. Centripetal force is the force that things are drawn towards the center, and centrifugal force seems to be, even though there's some debate about whether that's really a force, is what thrusts us outward. Maybe in a way, that drama that Jesus created at the temple was his way of trying to change the force that everything moves towards the temple, and that's where holiness, or everything moves towards being in a church building, and then turning that whole momentum the opposite direction so that it would be outward thrust. That would take tremendous power. And that's kind of how I view Jesus, his emotions, his anger, or his trying to get attention of the people to work with God so that it's not all this movement towards being together in church, but we come to church, we come to this place because we're getting prepared, we're getting nurtured and nourished so that God can thrust us out into the world. May God bless our reading and our understanding of his word for us this day.